Hi everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here with my February reading wrap-up. I read 14 books in February, a lot of variety, honestly just kind of a lot in general. I got through a lot in February and I'm really happy with how my reading went. But because I did get through so much, I don't want to waste your time because this is going to be kind of a longer video, so let's get right into it. The first book I finished is the only one I don't have a physical copy of, and that is A Long Way Home by Saroo Brierly. This is a memoir about a young Indian boy who got lost, wound up taking a train all the way to Calcutta, which was, a 30-hour train ride away, and then was adopted by an Australian couple. This happened when he was 5, and then this book is him recounting his life and what happened, how that happened, and his current search and his adulthood for his Indian parents. There was a very well-known movie based on this book a few years ago called Lion. It starred Dev Patel, and I watched the movie first, and then I picked up the book, and I gave the book 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I listened to the audiobook for this, and it was so wonderful. The narrator is a Canadian narrator who's apparently very well known. I didn't write down his name, so I don't remember it, but it was a wonderful audiobook, and I think listening to something as an audiobook first really does affect how I experience the book. It changes my thoughts because so much of it is just based on the audiobook experience rather than the book itself, and I really loved it. I loved listening to his voice. I was always excited to pick it up and listen to it. I think story-wise, I thought more of it was going to be about his search for his parents and less about his childhood in India, and it wound up being like half the book it felt like was about his childhood in India, and then he searched for his parents for like a chapter or two, and then he found them. Because let's be perfectly honest, he just used Google Earth to like search along train lines, and that's not a very interesting story like to read about for a long period of time. So that was just like a chapter or two. But I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was really well done. I thought it was interesting, and I do highly recommend the audiobook if you're interested in it. The second book I read was continuing the Booktuber readathon for January because I only read one of the 4 books I intended to read in January, so I read Triss's book by Tamora Pierce. This is the second book in the Circle of Magic Quartet. I gave it 3 stars. This series in general follows a group of 4 kids who find out they have magical abilities at age 10, and their magical abilities are essentially tied to crafts. The magic flows through them into their work in these specific crafts. One of them is a plant mage, so his magic goes through plants. Triss in this one is a weather mage, so her weather goes through the magic. And she doesn't have just like outside magic that works with anything else. It's specifically tied to the weather. I do like this series. Like I said, I gave this 3 stars. It wasn't bad. It's a fun book. It's a fun series, but I always find myself wanting to connect more, and so much of it does feel like it's tied to the single conflict in this book. There's a big external conflict. Pirates are attacking the temple where these 4 kids live, and everything is based around the pirates, so they'll be like, oh, I should teach you this thing, but we don't have time, so let's use this one really quick workaround that like is not a good thing to use, but we're crunched for time. So I'm not going to spend time developing a skill. And it's just, that feels like how the whole book is. And I did like this one a little better than the first one. These are pre-reads for me, like I said. I do enjoy the characters, I enjoy the premise, but they always feel like they're just the teeniest bit lacking. So 3 stars. Then I moved on to book 3, which is Daja's book. Daja has magic with metalworking. She's a smith mage. I gave this one 4 stars. It is my favorite of the original quartet, and I did quite enjoy the fact that so much of this book wasn't centered around the big major external conflict. There's a forest fire going on. There are forest fires, but the kids aren't actually dealing with the forest fires for most of the book. Like, obviously that's the climax, but so much of it they're like off doing their own thing. They're developing Daja's past and Daja's culture, which I really, really enjoyed. So this one was 4 stars for me, and I think it was the standout of these 4 initial books. Then I read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. I buddy read this with Ariane over at Bookzelots, and I think we both really enjoyed this book. I gave this 4 stars. This is a nonfiction book about Henrietta Lacks, whose cells were taken in the 50s when she was dying of ovarian cancer. And they became the first human cells to exist outside of a human body for a significant period of time. Those cells multiplied very quickly. They became one of the greatest medical advancements in a long time. Or not necessarily that they became the greatest medical advancement, but those cells, the HeLa cells, have pioneered some of the greatest medical advancements in the last 70 years since they were taken. Henrietta Lacks herself was a poor, uneducated black woman who didn't give her consent, whose family didn't know about this for a long time, whose family never profited when everyone else in the medical industry was profiting off of this woman's body. And it's just the book of like what happened to Henrietta Lacks's family, what happened in science with those cells, and it was very fascinating. A little bit over my head at times, but a really wonderful book overall, and I would highly recommend it. I've rarely read anything that's so worthwhile, that hits me so hard, that like I read this book and felt like I'd gained something very important from reading it. I did have some issues with the author's motivations towards this because so much of this book is about how everyone else, especially white people, have profited off of this woman and her family. And Rebecca Skloot kind of seemed at times like she was yet another white person profiting off of this family, but I don't think that takes away completely from the fact that I learned so much about this book, and I think it's important to know Henrietta Lacks' story. So I would recommend it, and I'm so glad that Ariane and I buddy read this together. Then I finished off the Circle of Magic Quartet with Briar's book, which is the fourth and final book. I gave this one 3 stars. Briar is the plant mage that I mentioned before. He has magic dealing with plants, and this book is about a plague. There's a lot of like high stakes in this book, even compared to the other books in the series. It is kind of the overall climax, but again, I just found myself wanting to connect more, wanting to care more than I did, and I did have to push myself to finish this one. It was a little bit disappointing, but it's still a fun read. This whole series is a fun read. Like, I don't think they're the greatest thing ever, but if you like middle grade high fantasy, I would recommend picking these up at some point. Probably not making a priority out of them because I don't think they're anything you really need to rush to read, but they are worthwhile and they are fun. And the series, the world that continues after this, goes some really wonderful places. Then I read Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I've started listening to the audiobooks for this series, the ones that are narrated by Jim Dale. My original rating for this book and all the other times I've read it has been 4 stars, and I'm not going to change that rating. Most of this review, most of these thoughts on this book will be specifically about the audiobook and not anything else because Harry Potter's been talked to death. I like the audiobook to some degree. I think it's fun to listen to this series, and Jim Dale does a lot of very interesting voices, some of which I really love, some of which work really well. Others of them, not so much. And I think part of it is just, I've grown up on this series, like reading it myself and hearing it in my head for so many years, and then watching the movies even when I was a kid, and hearing those voices, and like these characters are kind of cemented in my head as who they are, and like how they sound is cemented in my head. So it'd be like a voice Jim Dale is doing for, I don't know, Hagrid or something, isn't necessarily a bad voice. It's just not how Hagrid sounds to me, so it sounds wrong. And it's like not an inherently bad thing. It's just how I perceive it is like negative, kind of. And I actually think Hagrid's voice in this was fine. I couldn't think of one I disliked, but Hermione's voice. I hated the way he did Hermione's voice, and I do think part of that is just because he is a grown man doing the voice of a 10-year-old girl in this book, and it's a little bit rough. Like every time Hermione's like, Harry, and I'm like, don't, it made me cringe so hard. But I did enjoy listening to it, and I have already continued on with the series, so it's a fun time. It wasn't a bad audiobook, but like, I can see why people who grew up listening to this audiobook really enjoy it and really connect with it, but I can also see how people who already have like their expectations cemented in their head don't like it quite so much, but I liked it fine. I finally continued on with the 3 Dark Crown series. I started it, I read the first book in November that I buddy read with A Beautiful Bookworm, Grace over at A Beautiful Bookworm. I'll link her down below, and I'll link everyone down below, as always, that I mention, and any reviews that I've done for these books already. This is a young adult fantasy series set on a magical island where they have 3 queens every generation. They're triplets, and they essentially fight to the death for the crown. I gave this book 4 stars, which was the same rating I gave the first one, and I could nitpick a lot of things about this book because there are a lot of small things that I have issues with. There are a lot of things that I don't think are done particularly well, but I'm not going to because none of that matters. I had fun with this book, and like that's all I really care about. Like if I have fun, if I care about the story, I don't care about all the little issues that I have throughout. Because it's doing the important thing right. It makes me care. I'm invested. I think this is a very fun story. I think compared to the first book, the pacing was better. It was fun to already know these characters and not have to have long introductions. It was just fun to follow them along. The two negative things I do have to say is I don't like one of the characters' directions. Katarine, I think her name is pronounced. I meant to look up before this video, but I didn't, and I'm lazy. One of the queens, I call her Catherine in my head, so I'm just gonna say that in this video because I don't care, and Kendare Blake doesn't care. Catherine's character has gone a direction I don't particularly care for. It's just not a direction that I like in characters. And in addition to that, the ending of this book kind of left me feeling like the rest of the series might not be particularly great, or at least the third book might not. I didn't like the way it ended, and I think the ending, had this been the final book in the series, the ending would have knocked this down a star for me. But because it's only book 2 out of 4 books, I don't mind it that much. But this is a fun series. If you like young adult fantasy, I would recommend picking up this series because I've quite enjoyed it so far, and it's just a fun time. Like, I like reading books that are a fun time, and this series 100% is. Then I read The Lucky One by Rader-Day. This is one of the arcs I got for work, and this is an adult thriller about, what is it about? I've already forgotten. It's about a woman who was kidnapped when she was a child. Her father was a policeman, he rescued her, and she was only gone for a few hours. This is about her as an adult kind of exploring that kidnapping. She sees a picture of the man who kidnapped her, and that kind of leads her down this path of trying to figure out what happened and like trying to put it to rest once and for all. I gave this 3 stars, and I think my overall feeling for this book was that it was so dull, which was disappointing to me because it had a lot of elements that I usually really like, and elements that I felt like were well done. Like, this wasn't a book where I really had much negative to say about it, especially like the specific elements. It deals with a missing persons group online, like this online community of just like amateurs who enjoy doing this for fun, just searching for missing persons, which was really interesting, and it was done in like a relatively realistic way, you know, like it's a thriller book, like compared to other thrillers, it was done very realistically. And it deals with like this woman reflecting back on this childhood trauma, which I really enjoy in books, and like it was well paced, like all the elements like worked really well together. There was a lot going on, but it was just like a well crafted story, and yet I found it so dull. This is a book that I feel like I really should have enjoyed, and I didn't. I didn't really care about it. It was just kind of like 3 stars. Okay, I'll forget it very quickly. So I am quite disappointed by this one, honestly, because it sounded so amazing, and even talking about it makes it sound good. But I found it very boring. I was bored throughout reading this. Then continuing on with mediocre thrillers, I read You Were Here by Gian Sardar. This was recommended to me by Ashley Bundy. I'll link her review of this book down below. This is an adult thriller set in 2 timelines. One is in the 1940s about this married man who's having an affair with this woman, and they fall in love, and his wife gets involved, and it's a whole big thing. And then present day, where this woman has nightmares and she returns to her hometown and there's a rapist on the loose, and I gave it 3 stars as well. I like this one less, I will say. There was a long while I considered giving this book 2 stars. It just seemed not well done to me. There wasn't a whole lot I liked about this one, and I don't want to do like a whole big long spiel on this book because I just really don't care. I didn't think it was very well done. I didn't like her writing style. It felt very overwritten, just like in general. I wanted her to just like relax with the writing a little bit. The writing felt like it was trying so hard, and I could see the effort that she was putting in, and it made it kind of unpleasant to read. And also, so much of this book focused on cheating. Just like everyone in both timelines were just like cheating on each other. And it was the kind of story where I wouldn't say it was justified, but it was leaning towards like, hey, like cheating is bad, but also they're in love, so that makes it less bad. And I was like, no, that just makes me hate them more for being like self-righteous hypocrites. So it was kind of frustrating to read that. And normally I don't care about cheating in books. It was just when it was trying so hard to justify it just a little bit, it irritated me. And there were some supernatural elements in this book that I didn't enjoy, that I don't think worked very well. But again, I'm not someone who really enjoys supernatural elements in otherwise realistic fiction books, so that just wasn't for me. I don't know. I wasn't a fan of this book in pretty much any capacity. It wasn't bad. The way I talk about it makes it sound bad, but it was just kind of mediocre, and I was like, okay, I read it. It's a book I read, and the end. I'll forget it in a week, so it really doesn't matter. Then I read Two Dark Reigns, which is the third book in the Three Dark Crown series. I gave this one 3 stars. It wasn't that it was so much worse than the first two. It was just kind of like the other two were just barely 4 stars, and this was just barely short of that. Again, young adult fantasy. I did still enjoy it. It's still a fun story, but I do think the ending of the second book kind of left this book in a way where half of this book was just kind of setting up for what was going to happen in the climax in the next book in the finale for this series, and half of this book was kind of like a side story, and it was fine. It wasn't bad. I still do like following these characters. It was just this book felt like it was going nowhere for a lot of it, and it was just like we were waiting to get back to the main plot and the main story and waiting for the big things to happen again. And finally, in like the ending of this book, the big things started happening again. So I do hope that the final book would be another 4 stars. It's a fun series. I didn't think this one was bad. It was just like a little bit less good than the other two. Then I finished The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which I was reading for most of February. I was buddy reading this with Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics, and I think we both wound up really enjoying this one. I gave it 4 stars. This is an adult fiction, I guess, mystery, contemporary, literary fiction thing. I don't like using the term literary fiction, but what other genre is there for just this is a pretentious book? But I liked it. I gave this 4 stars. It's about a group of friends in college who wind up killing one of their friends and then kind of just being pretentious along the way. That's a bad way to describe it, but also it's accurate. I really enjoyed this. Donna Tartt has this way of writing a lot. She writes a lot when she doesn't have to, and I like it. It makes the book slow. She slows down everything to like a minuscule degree until like everything is just like written through in such detail, and I really enjoy that. I find it a really compelling way to tell the story. And like these kids, this group of friends are just like sociopaths almost. Like they don't feel anything. They don't like I mean, they do feel things to some degree, but it's like they spend so much time on logic and being like, this is the logical way to approach this situation. We must murder him because that is logical. And it's so interesting to be in their heads because it's so like, evil's not a word I really believe in or would use, but it's like borderline, just like these people who are just looking at life in like a logical way, in a way that like isn't a normal approach to life, I guess I would say. And you could see that start to break at points, and it was so interesting when they would like actually see the grief that people were feeling and actually like feel something themselves and be like, oh no, like this isn't just logic, like you can't just look at life in a logic-based way. And I'm explaining this really poorly, but I did find it very interesting. I gave it 4 stars. This isn't a book that I loved, and it's not one that will make my end of year like favorites list, but it was so interesting, so worthwhile, and I'm very glad I read it. For the Booktuber Readathon February edition, I read Magic Steps by Tamora Pierce. This is the first book in the Circle Opens quartet, which is the quartet that follows the Circle of Magic. This book is about Sandry, who is a Stitch Witch. It's a middle grade / YA fantasy series. Sandry has magic with weaving, and there is a murder mystery kind of aspect going on. This group of people are using this thing called unmagic to murder these merchants and this whole merchant family. And Sandry finds a student who has magic with dancing, and they kind of like fight against the murderers. And it's really cool. It's really interesting. I gave it 3 stars though. Like, again, I just want to connect with this series, with these books more than I do. I love the characters. I love the premise, and there's so many elements in these books that I love, and yet I find myself just wanting to connect more. But they're still fun. They're still fine. Like, I don't dislike them at all. I think they're fun, worthwhile books, but also not the greatest thing ever. I also finished Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets by J.K. Rowling. Again, listening to the Jim Dale audiobooks. This is 5 stars for me. As it always is, I'm not changing the ratings with these audiobooks. Don't have much to say, except I love the way Jim Dale does Gilderoy Lockhart's voice. I think it was spot on. It was perfect. It was hilarious. Like it's fun to listen to these books as like a theatrical performance because in one that I haven't experienced before. Like it does bring something a little bit new and a little bit fun. And it's been so long since I had anything new for like the original series. So it's been fun, and I've already started listening to the third book, and I like that as well. So not much to say. I like it. Chintale's not my favorite, but it's quite fun. And the final book that I finished in February was Street Magic by Tamora Pierce. This is book 2 in the Circle Open series. So I got halfway through this series in February for the rereadathon. This is, again, another high fantasy middle grade / YA series about these 4 kids who have magical powers, and it's just, they're 14 in these books. They were 10 in the Circle of Magic books. And this one is about Briar, the plant mage again. He finds a student because in all the Circle Opens books, they find students and kind of just like teach them. It is really interesting. I don't think this one is my favorite. I give it 3 stars. It deals a lot with like gang violence and gang warfare, but very shallowly. I feel like there's a lot more that I feel like Pierce could have done in this book with in terms of like the gang politics, and I think she only scratched the surface. I just wish there'd been more of that, like more exploration of it. And I don't know. Briar finds a stone mage, and it is interesting. They just deal with gangs in this book. I don't know. It was interesting. It was fun. I gave it 3 stars again. Like there's not so much I can say about these books. They're just like solid books. But not my favorite also. But yeah, I liked it. And that concludes everything that I read in February. And I didn't realize until just going through this how many of these were like middle grade or young adult fantasy novels, because that made up a lot of what I read, which is kind of weird for me, but that's what happens when I go through Tamora Pierce and Harry Potter at the same time. It just takes over everything. But it was a good February. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them if you have. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.